Our story begins not in the opulent palaces of St. Petersburg, but in the desolate, windswept plains of Siberia, where a man of enigmatic power and unsettling charisma was destined to emerge, shaking the very foundations of Imperial Russia. This is the tale of Grigori Rasputin, a figure so shrouded in myth, rumor, and outright fabrication that separating the man from the legend becomes an odyssey in itself. Imperial Russia, at the dawn of the 20th century, was an empire teetering on the precipice, a vast, ancient realm struggling to reconcile its autocratic traditions with the relentless march of modernity. Beneath the glittering facade of the Romanov dynasty, unrest simmered among the serfs, discontent brewed within the burgeoning industrial working class, and radical ideas permeated the intelligentsia. The Tsar, Nicholas II, a man of profound personal piety but limited political acumen, ruled over 150 million subjects spread across 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. His empress, Alexandra Feodorovna, a German princess by birth, was fiercely devoted to her husband and increasingly isolated from the Russian court, her shy nature often misinterpreted as arrogance. Their world, seemingly unshakable, was ripe for a catalyst, a disruptive force that would expose the cracks in the gilded cage of autocracy. And that force, incredibly, would arrive in the form of an unkempt, illiterate peasant from a remote village, a man whose hypnotic gaze and alleged spiritual gifts would draw him into the innermost sanctum of power. We open on a cold, foreboding landscape, the vastness of Russia symbolizing the immense challenges facing the Romanovs. The air is heavy with an unspoken tension, a sense of impending doom that Rasputin, with his peculiar brand of mysticism, would both predict and, arguably, accelerate. His eventual arrival in the capital would not merely be a social curiosity, it would be a spiritual intrusion, a political earthquake that reverberated through every level of society, ultimately hastening the collapse of a 300-year-old dynasty. This is the story of how a single man, dismissed by many as a charlatan and revered by others as a saint, became inextricably linked to the fate of an empire, forever etching his name into the annals of history as the Mad Monk. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin was born on January 21, 1869, in the remote Siberian village of Pokrovskoye, nestled along the Tura River. His early life was typical of a Russian peasant in that era, harsh, impoverished, and largely uneducated. He grew up tending horses and working the land, a strong, strapping young man with piercing blue eyes that were said to possess an unnerving intensity even in his youth. The village itself was a place where ancient superstitions and Orthodox Christianity intertwined, fostering a fertile ground for mystical inclinations. Unlike his peers, however, Grigori displayed an early propensity for introspection and, some say, mischief. Stories from his youth paint a picture of a restless soul, prone to petty thievery and known for his boisterous behavior. The name, Rasputin itself, derived from the Russian word, raspidny, meaning dissolute, or licentious, hints at his early reputation, though it may also have been a common surname in the region. A pivotal moment in his early life, around the age of 28, remains shrouded in mystery, but it involved a profound spiritual awakening. Some accounts suggest a vision of the Virgin Mary, others a deeply transformative pilgrimage to a monastery. What is certain is that Grigori abandoned his conventional peasant life, his wife Prasovya Fyodorovna Dubrovina, and his 3 surviving children, to embark on a new path. He became a strannik, or wanderer, traveling across Russia and beyond, visiting monasteries, holy sites, and conversing with hermits and ascetics. During this period, he honed his skills as a self-proclaimed starets, or holy elder, despite lacking any formal monastic training. He developed a captivating, if unconventional, form of spiritual guidance. He preached not with eloquent sermons, but with a raw, earthy wisdom, interspersed with biblical passages and homespun parables. His ability to connect with people, to discern their innermost thoughts and anxieties, and to offer comfort, was remarkable. He cultivated an image of profound humility and spiritual insight, despite his often coarse manners and unwashed appearance. Rumors of his healing abilities began to circulate, stories of him curing ailments through prayer and touch, of his prophecies coming true. These tales, amplified by his magnetic personality, began to precede him, building a formidable reputation in the vast, spiritually hungry landscape of turn-of-the-century Russia. The journey from a Siberian hamlet to the imperial capital was long, arduous, and seemingly improbable, yet Rasputin had begun to forge the legend that would ultimately lead him to the very heart of the Romanov dynasty. His origins, steeped in the mysticism of the Russian countryside, would forever define his appeal and his mystique, contrasting sharply with the refined world he was destined to enter. By the early 1900s, Rasputin's wanderings had taken him far from Pokrovskoye. His reputation as a holy man, a starets with extraordinary spiritual powers, had spread through provincial towns and villages. He wasn't a monk in the traditional sense, he never took vows or joined a monastery. Instead, he was a self-styled spiritual advisor, a God's fool, in the Russian tradition, whose unconventional piety captivated the religiously fervent. His methods were unorthodox, mixing fervent prayer with strange, sometimes sexually suggestive, rituals. He preached that one must sin to truly repent, a philosophy that would later be twisted and used against him, feeding into the mad monk narrative. But for many, especially the poor and the sick, his direct, unvarnished approach was a refreshing change from the often rigid formalism of the official church. Stories of his miraculous cures and prophetic insights became campfire tales, whispered in marketplaces and shared in churches. He possessed an almost animalistic magnetism, a raw energy that drew people to him. He was rumored to have the ability to calm horses with a touch, to see into men's souls, and to alleviate suffering with a simple prayer. These stories, embellished with each retelling, eventually reached the ears of higher society. The Russian elite, particularly women, were deeply superstitious and prone to mystical fads at this time. The spiritual vacuum left by the rigid hierarchy of the Orthodox Church and the perceived coldness of scientific rationalism created a craving for something more immediate, more personal, more miraculous. This yearning for spiritual authenticity made them susceptible to figures like Rasputin. Through a network of influential contacts, often aristocratic women drawn to his charisma, Rasputin began his slow, deliberate ascent towards the capital. Initially, he sought out prominent church figures in Kazan and Kiev, impressing some with his sincerity, alarming others with his unconventional practices. His path eventually led him to the famed theological academies of St. Petersburg, a city of stark contrasts, where Byzantine domes stood alongside Art Nouveau mansions, and ancient traditions clashed with revolutionary fervor. It was here, in the winter of 1903, that Rasputin, the unlettered peasant, truly began to gain traction within the upper echelons of Russian society. He was introduced to influential figures like Bishop Theophan and Father John of Kronstadt, both highly respected spiritual leaders, who initially endorsed his authenticity. They saw in him a genuine expression of Russian popular piety, a direct conduit to the spiritual heart of the peasant masses. Little did they know that this seemingly humble starets would soon bypass them entirely, ascending to a position of unprecedented influence directly within the Romanov household, a move that would prove disastrous for all involved. His journey was not merely a physical one but a transition from the periphery of Russian life to its very epicenter, bringing with him the wild, untamed spirit of Siberia into the gilded cages of power. The year is 1905. Russia is reeling from defeat in the Russo-Japanese War and the bloody suppression of the 1905 revolution. The Tsar's authority is shaken, and a deep sense of unease pervades the court. It is against this backdrop of national crisis and personal anguish that Grigori Rasputin finally gains access to the imperial family. Empress Alexandra, burdened by the immense pressure of her role and perpetually anxious about her only son's health, was increasingly isolated. Her deep spirituality bordered on mysticism, a common trait among the European aristocracy of the era. She sought solace and guidance from various spiritual figures, often falling prey to charlatans and eccentric, holy men, who promised miracles. The primary source of her anguish, and indeed the Romanovs' greatest secret, was the health of Tsarevich Alexei, the heir to the throne. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a genetic blood disorder inherited from his mother, which meant even a minor bump or bruise could lead to agonizing internal bleeding, potentially fatal. The disease, incurable at the time, cast a dark shadow over the entire dynasty. Every fall, every bruise, brought the imperial couple to the brink of despair. Their lives revolved around protecting Alexei, and their desperation made them vulnerable to anyone who offered a glimmer of hope. In November 1905, through the social network of the Montenegrin princesses Malika and Anastasia, sisters-in-law to Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, who were deeply involved in spiritualism, Rasputin was finally presented to Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra. Initially, he was just one of many holy men passing through the palace. But unlike the others, Rasputin possessed a unique quality. He didn't offer high-flown theological lectures or elaborate rituals. Instead, he spoke in simple, earthy parables, his words direct and disarmingly sincere. He possessed an uncanny ability to read people, to touch their fears and hopes, and, most importantly, he seemed to possess a calming effect on Alexei. Alexandra was instantly captivated. She saw in Rasputin not a cunning charlatan, but a genuine man of God, a simple peasant whose prayers could perhaps intercede where modern medicine failed. Nicholas, though more reserved, was also impressed by Rasputin's apparent humility and his comforting presence. For the royal couple, tormented by their son's illness, Rasputin represented a last, desperate hope. His arrival at court was initially discreet, a private arrangement, far from the public eye. But this clandestine introduction would soon blossom into an unparalleled influence, intertwining the destiny of an obscure Siberian peasant with the fate of one of the world's most powerful empires. The vulnerability of the Romanovs, particularly the Empress, would prove to be Rasputin's ultimate gateway to power, setting the stage for a dramatic and tragic chapter in Russian history. The true source of Rasputin's power and his unbreakable hold over the imperial family stemmed directly from the health of Tsarevich Alexei. While his initial introductions to court were based on his perceived spiritual authority, it was his apparent ability to alleviate Alexei's suffering that cemented his position. The doctors, despite their best efforts and cutting-edge medical knowledge, were helpless against hemophilia. Their treatments often involved aspirin, which, unbeknownst to them, actually exacerbated bleeding. They could offer no real comfort, no genuine hope. When Alexei experienced one of his agonizing bleeding episodes, often from a simple fall, the boy would be in excruciating pain, his joints swelling, his life hanging by a thread. The Empress, distraught and desperate, would send for Rasputin. And time and again, when Rasputin was summoned, Alexei's condition would, seemingly miraculously, improve. How did he do it? Historians and medical professionals have put forward several theories. One popular theory suggests that Rasputin understood the importance of calming the boy. In a state of high anxiety, Alexei's heart rate would increase, intensifying the bleeding. Rasputin's serene presence, his soothing voice, and his lack of alarm might have had a profound psychological effect, relaxing the boy and thereby helping to slow the bleeding. Furthermore, it's believed that Rasputin likely instructed the doctors to cease their ineffective and harmful treatments, particularly the aspirin, which would have naturally improved Alexei's prognosis during a crisis. He was also observed to forbid the medical staff from fussing over the boy, creating a calmer environment. Whatever the exact mechanism, the results were undeniable to the Empress. When the doctors failed, Rasputin succeeded. For Alexandra, a woman of deep religious conviction, this was nothing short of a divine miracle, proof that Rasputin was indeed a man sent by God to save her son and, by extension, the dynasty. This perceived miracle created an emotional and psychological bond that no amount of court gossip, public outcry, or political pressure could sever. Rasputin became indispensable, not just as a healer, but as a spiritual confidant, a source of comfort and strength for a lonely, anxious empress. His influence was now cemented. He was no longer just a holy man. He was the protector of the heir, the lifeline to the future of the Romanovs. This unique position gave him unprecedented access and, inevitably, unprecedented power, setting the stage for his foray into the dangerous world of imperial politics, a world for which he was utterly unprepared. With his position secured by the miracles performed for Tsarevich Alexei, Rasputin's influence at court began to expand far beyond the nursery. Empress Alexandra, utterly convinced of his saintliness and reliant on his spiritual guidance, increasingly turned to him for advice on matters of state. Nicholas II, while never as completely enamored with Rasputin as his wife, deferred to Alexandra's judgment, especially when it concerned their son. This created a dangerous vacuum of power that Rasputin, consciously or unconsciously, began to fill. His physical presence in St. Petersburg became more permanent, though he still maintained his humble apartment, often frequented by petitioners from all walks of life. The court, initially skeptical, soon learned that access to the empress, and by extension the Tsar, could be gained through Rasputin. Ambitious courtiers, desperate politicians, and even religious figures began to seek his favor. He became a conduit for appointments, promotions, and dismissals. A word from Rasputin could make or break a career. Ministers found themselves unexpectedly out of favor after a supposed slight to the starets. Others, who cultivated his good graces, found themselves elevated to positions of power despite questionable qualifications. The Russian Orthodox Church, initially supportive of Rasputin, became increasingly alarmed. His unconventional theology, his scandalous behavior, and his direct access to the imperial family bypassing all ecclesiastical authority were deeply unsettling. Yet, attempts by church leaders to discredit him were met with fierce resistance from the empress, who saw any criticism of Rasputin as an attack on her son's health and on God's will. She staunchly defended him, often to the detriment of her own reputation and the stability of the monarchy. Rasputin himself, while often giving sound advice to the Tsar, such as advocating for peace and caution against war, also became entangled in petty intrigues and favors. He might recommend a particular general or politician, often based on personal loyalty or even bribery. He possessed no formal education in statecraft, no understanding of diplomacy, and no experience in military strategy, yet his counsel was increasingly sought and, crucially, often heeded by the empress. The court became a hotbed of intrigue and rumor. Whispers about Rasputin's lavish lifestyle, his drinking, his womanizing, and his alleged hypnotic powers spread like wildfire. He was seen dining in expensive restaurants, surrounded by fawning admirers, and his behavior was often far from that expected of a holy man. These rumors, some true, some exaggerated, contributed to a growing public perception that the imperial family was under the sway of a depraved mystic. This perception began to erode the very legitimacy of the Romanov dynasty. The people, already discontent, now saw their beloved Tsar and Empress as puppets controlled by a Dark One. This period marks the transformation of Rasputin from a simple healer into a formidable, albeit controversial, political force, his shadow lengthening over the twilight of Imperial Russia. As Rasputin's influence at court grew, so too did the public's fascination and outrage. The whispers that circulated within the palace walls inevitably spilled onto the streets and into the burgeoning tabloid press. Newspapers, eager for sensational stories, painted Rasputin as the Dark One, the Mad Monk, a depraved, power-hungry charlatan who held the empress, and by extension the entire nation, under his demonic spell. The rumors were plentiful and lurid. Stories of his orgies with society women, his public drunkenness, his crude manners, and his alleged sexual escapades became common fodder for gossip. While many of these tales were undoubtedly exaggerated or outright fabricated by his enemies, Rasputin's own behavior often provided ample material. He frequented bathhouses and taverns, and his interactions with women, particularly those seeking his spiritual guidance, were often unconventional and sometimes predatory. He had a strong belief in the idea of spiritual purification through sin and repentance, a concept that was easily misinterpreted and exploited by his detractors. This belief, combined with his charismatic appeal to women, made him a magnet for scandal. The press, emboldened by the lack of effective censorship and fueled by those within the court who opposed Rasputin, capitalized on every rumor. Cartoons depicted him as a satyr-like figure, a demonic puppet master pulling the strings of the Tsar and Empress. Pamphlets circulated widely, detailing his alleged crimes and corrupting influence. This relentless negative publicity inflicted immense damage on the prestige of the monarchy. The Romanovs, traditionally seen as divine rulers, were now perceived as weak, foolish, and under the sway of a Siberian peasant. This erosion of public trust was catastrophic, particularly in a period of increasing social unrest. The Empress, stubbornly defending her friend, refused to acknowledge the damage being done. She believed the attacks on Rasputin were attacks on her faith, and ultimately on her son's well-being. This made her even more isolated and reliant on Rasputin, creating a vicious cycle. Nicholas II, while concerned by the public outcry, was too weak-willed to act decisively. He often tried to remove Rasputin from St. Petersburg, only for Alexandra to bring him back or find a way for them to communicate. This constant vacillation further undermined his authority. The scandal surrounding Rasputin was not just a personal tragedy for him, it was a symptom of a deeper malaise within the Russian state. It highlighted the Romanovs' detachment from reality, their inability to connect with their people, and their dangerous reliance on mysticism in a time of rationalistic upheaval. The Dark One narrative, whether true or false, became a powerful symbol of everything that was perceived to be wrong with the crumbling imperial system. It fueled the revolutionary fires, painting the monarchy as corrupt, decadent, and utterly out of touch. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 plunged Russia, and indeed all of Europe, into an unprecedented catastrophe. For Tsar Nicholas II, it was a moment of patriotic fervor and a desperate gamble to unite his fractured nation. However, the war would prove to be the ultimate undoing of the Romanov dynasty, and Rasputin's role during this period would become even more central and destructive. Initially, Rasputin had actually advised against Russia's entry into the war, reportedly sending a telegram to Nicholas warning him, "A terrible disaster will come upon Russia. All will be drowned in blood." His counsel, however, was ignored as the drums of war beat louder. Once the war began, Nicholas II, in a move that historians widely consider to be disastrous, decided in September 1915 to take personal command of the Russian army at the front. This decision removed him from the political center of the empire, leaving Empress Alexandra in charge of domestic affairs. Isolated and increasingly reliant on her spiritual advisor, Alexandra leaned heavily on Rasputin's counsel for everything from ministerial appointments to military strategy. With Nicholas away, the Empress and Rasputin effectively governed Russia. Alexandra, driven by a fierce loyalty to her husband and an unshakable belief in Rasputin's divine connection, dismissed any criticism of him as treasonous. She saw him as the only true link to God's will for Russia and for Alexei's health. The consequences were devastating. Rasputin, with his lack of political experience, was easily swayed by those who sought to exploit his influence. His recommendations for ministerial positions often favored sycophants or those who promised him favors, leading to a rapid succession of incompetent and often corrupt officials. The government became a revolving door of ministers, each lasting only a few months, nicknamed ministerial leapfrog. This constant instability paralyzed the administration at a time when effective governance was desperately needed to manage the war effort. Supplies to the front lines were erratic, logistics collapsed, and morale plummeted. The public and the Duma, Russia's parliament, looked on in horror. The sight of a German-born empress, perceived as being under the spell of a Siberian peasant, making critical decisions for Russia during a war against Germany, fueled widespread accusations of treason and incompetence. Rumors spread that Rasputin was a German spy, that Alexandra was in league with the enemy, and that the entire court was corrupt. These accusations, though largely unfounded in terms of direct treason, eroded public trust in the monarchy to an irreparable degree. The war magnified all of Russia's existing problems and provided Rasputin with an unprecedented, unchallenged stage for his influence, solidifying his reputation as the primary orchestrator of the empire's impending collapse. His presence became a lightning rod for all the discontent brewing in a nation on the brink. With Tsar Nicholas II at the war front, Empress Alexandra, firmly under Rasputin's spell, assumed de facto control of domestic affairs. This arrangement proved catastrophic for Russia and accelerated the decline of the Romanov dynasty. The Empress, a shy and often stubborn woman, deeply resented anyone who criticized Rasputin, viewing such dissent as an affront to God and to her son's health. Her isolation from Russian society and her foreign background made her an easy target for criticism, which only strengthened her reliance on Rasputin. The period from 1915 to 1916 became notorious for what was dubbed ministerial leapfrog. Russia saw 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of the interior, 3 foreign ministers, 3 ministers of war, and 4 ministers of agriculture in less than 2 years. Each appointment and dismissal was often orchestrated by Rasputin, or at least heavily influenced by his advice to Alexandra. The criteria for appointment were rarely competence or experience. Instead, loyalty to Rasputin, or the promise of favors, often played a deciding role. For example, Boris Sturmer, a man widely considered incompetent and even suspected of German sympathies, a particularly damaging rumor during a war with Germany, was appointed prime minister and foreign minister largely due to Rasputin's backing. Capable officials who dared to question Rasputin's influence or his suitability for court were swiftly dismissed, replaced by sycophants or pliable figures. This constant turnover created immense instability. No minister could implement long-term policies, build a coherent administration, or effectively manage the colossal demands of the war effort. The bureaucracy descended into chaos, riddled with corruption and inefficiency. Crucial decisions were delayed, supplies to the front were disrupted, and the economy began to collapse. The military suffered immensely from this political paralysis. Soldiers at the front, lacking proper equipment, food, and medical supplies, questioned the competence of their leadership. At home, peasants faced starvation, and workers staged strikes, all while the government seemed incapable of addressing their grievances, being too preoccupied with internal court intrigues. For the Russian people, it became clear that the imperial government was no longer functioning effectively. The image of the Tsar, traditionally seen as the benevolent father of his people, was shattered. The empress was widely reviled, and Rasputin became the embodiment of everything wrong with the system. This period of political chaos, directly attributed to Rasputin's unchecked influence, profoundly alienated every segment of Russian society: the Duma, the army, the aristocracy, the church, and the common people. It created a power vacuum that revolutionary forces would soon eagerly fill, undermining the very foundations of the Romanov Empire from within. By late 1916, the situation in Russia had reached a breaking point. The devastating losses in World War I, the severe food shortages, the economic collapse, and the perceived incompetence of the government had plunged the nation into despair. Amidst this turmoil, Rasputin stood as the ultimate scapegoat, the embodiment of all that was wrong with Imperial Russia. He was universally hated across all strata of society, from the impoverished peasants who saw him as a demonic force, to the liberal politicians who viewed him as an obstacle to reform, to the conservative aristocrats and church leaders who considered him a blasphemous disgrace. The empress's unwavering defense of him, despite his increasingly scandalous behavior and the chaos he brought to governance, only solidified the conviction that he had to be removed. Many believed that as long as Rasputin remained, Russia was doomed, and the Romanov dynasty could not be saved. The Tsar and Tsarina, blinded by their personal devotion and belief in Rasputin's divine mission, seemed incapable of understanding the political damage he caused. Attempts by various figures, including members of the imperial family, to persuade the Tsar to dismiss Rasputin had repeatedly failed. Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, Alexandra's own sister, pleaded with her to break free from Rasputin's influence, only to be rebuffed. Even Rasputin's former benefactors in the church, now aghast at his moral decay and political meddling, condemned him. With all legitimate avenues exhausted, a dark consensus began to form among a small but determined group of aristocratic conspirators. Rasputin had to be eliminated. This sentiment was driven by a desperate patriotism, a belief that only by removing the Dark One could Russia be saved from revolution and the Romanovs from destruction. The plotters were a curious mix of individuals, united by their hatred of Rasputin and their desire to preserve the monarchy. Among them were some of the most prominent figures in Russian society: Prince Felix Yusupov, a wealthy and eccentric aristocrat, married to the Tsar's niece Irina; Vladimir Purishkovich, a fiery right-wing Duma deputy known for his impassioned speeches; and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a cousin of Tsar Nicholas II. These men believed they were acting to save their country and their beloved imperial family. Their motives, while perhaps noble in their own minds, were ultimately flawed, for they failed to grasp the depth of the rot within the imperial system. The removal of Rasputin, they hoped, would be a surgical strike that would heal the empire. Instead, it would prove to be a desperate act that merely signaled the terminal illness of a dying regime, paving the way for its final, violent collapse. The conspiracy to murder Rasputin was born out of a profound sense of despair, a desperate gamble that would ironically achieve the opposite of its intended goal. The stage was set for the night of December 29, 1916. The chief orchestrator of the plot, Prince Felix Yusupov, meticulously planned the assassination, believing it to be a patriotic act of salvation for Russia. His chosen location was the basement of his lavish Moika Palace in St. Petersburg, a sprawling edifice on the Moika River. The co-conspirators included Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the fiercely nationalist Duma deputy Vladimir Purishkovich, and a young military doctor named Stanislaus Lazavert. Yusupov's plan was simple yet elaborate. Lure Rasputin to the palace under the pretext of an introduction to his beautiful wife, Princess Irina, whom Rasputin allegedly desired to meet. Irina, however, was conveniently away in Crimea. On the chosen night, Yusupov sent his car to fetch Rasputin from his apartment. Around midnight, Rasputin, dressed in a silk-embroidered shirt, arrived at the Moika Palace. Yusupov led him down to the basement, a specially prepared room adorned with Persian carpets, a fireplace, and a large dining table laden with cakes and Madeira wine. Upstairs, Purishkovich, Dmitry, and Lazavert waited anxiously, listening for a signal. The first phase of the plan involved poison. Lazavert, the doctor, had laced the Madeira wine and several chocolate cakes with potassium cyanide, enough to kill a dozen men instantly. Yusupov offered Rasputin the poisoned treats. To the conspirators' astonishment, Rasputin ate the cakes and drank the wine, seemingly without effect. He joked, he sang, he even asked for more. Yusupov grew increasingly anxious, observing Rasputin closely. He reported back to his co-conspirators, his voice trembling, that the poison seemed to have no effect. Was Rasputin truly immune, blessed with some unholy resistance? Was he merely a fraud, or something more? The sheer resilience of the man, combined with his unsettling calm, began to unnerve Yusupov. After 2 hours of futile attempts to poison him, Yusupov returned to the basement, now armed with a revolver. The conspirators, hidden upstairs, were growing desperate. The night was slipping away, and their meticulous plan was unraveling. The tension in the palace was palpable, thick with fear and the scent of impending violence. Yusupov descended the stairs, determined to end the charade. This was the moment of decision, the point of no return. What was intended as a swift, clean dispatch was rapidly turning into a horrifying, drawn-out ordeal, foreshadowing the violent chaos that would soon engulf Russia itself. The cyanide, meant to be lethal, had inexplicably failed to fell Rasputin. Frustration and panic mounted among the conspirators. Prince Yusupov, now convinced that only direct action would suffice, returned to the basement with a revolver. He engaged Rasputin in conversation, asking him to look at an ornate crucifix. As Rasputin gazed at the icon, Yusupov raised the gun and fired, striking him in the chest. Rasputin collapsed, seemingly dead. The conspirators upstairs, hearing the shot, briefly believed their mission accomplished. Yusupov and his accomplices left the basement, intending to dispose of the body. But a short while later, Yusupov returned to ensure Rasputin was truly gone. He leaned over the body, perhaps to check for a pulse, or simply to gaze upon the fallen, dark one. In a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Rasputin's eyes suddenly flew open. With a guttural roar, he lunged at Yusupov, grabbing him by the throat and uttering, "You naughty boy. You will be hanged." The sheer terror of this moment, the unkillable monk, rising from the dead, sent Yusupov into a frenzy. He struggled free, Rasputin pursuing him up the palace stairs, staggering through the courtyard, attempting to escape into the snowy night. The other conspirators, hearing the commotion, rushed out. Vladimir Purishkovich, armed with his own pistol, fired several shots at the fleeing Rasputin. 2 bullets found their mark, one in his back, another in his head. Rasputin finally crumpled in the snow. Even then, the conspirators were not entirely convinced. The legend of Rasputin's invincibility was now terrifyingly real. To ensure his demise, they dragged his battered, bleeding body back into the palace, wrapped him in a heavy curtain, and drove him to the Malaya Nevka River. There, they bound him and threw him into the icy waters, below the Petrovsky Bridge. The freezing temperatures and the weight of his bindings were meant to guarantee he would never trouble them again. Days later, Rasputin's body was recovered from the river. The autopsy revealed a shocking detail. Water was found in his lungs. This suggested that he had still been alive, and possibly struggling, when he entered the icy river, dying not from the poison or the bullets, but from hypothermia and drowning. The mad monk had indeed proven exceptionally difficult to kill, his final moments shrouded in a struggle for life against overwhelming odds. The brutality and sheer desperation of his assassination reflected the raw, visceral hatred he inspired, and the almost supernatural aura of survival that surrounded him, even in death. His end was as violent and mysterious as his life, a testament to the chaotic times he lived in and helped to shape. The assassination of Grigori Rasputin on December 30, 1916, was intended by its perpetrators to save the monarchy, to remove the cancerous growth that was consuming the Romanovs' prestige and power. Ironically, it had precisely the opposite effect. Far from stabilizing the empire, Rasputin's death plunged Russia into even greater instability and accelerated the pace towards revolution. The immediate reaction to his death was complex. Among the general populace and much of the aristocracy, there was a sense of relief, even celebration. Many genuinely believed that a great evil had been vanquished, and that the imperial family, now free from his influence, would regain its footing. However, for Tsar Nicholas II and particularly Empress Alexandra, Rasputin's death was a profound, personal tragedy. Alexandra was devastated. She saw his murder not just as the loss of a trusted friend and spiritual guide, but as a direct assault on her family, her faith, and her only son's protector. She viewed the conspirators as murderers, and the ensuing public approval of their actions as a betrayal of the monarchy itself. Her grief was immense, and her resolve to resist any further compromise hardened. The Tsar, deeply affected by his wife's sorrow, made only a perfunctory attempt to investigate the murder. While the identities of the killers were an open secret, their aristocratic connections and the widespread public sentiment in their favor prevented any serious prosecution. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich was exiled to Persia, and Felix Yusupov to his estates, but no severe punishment was meted out. This perceived leniency further angered the empress and deepened her sense of isolation. Politically, Rasputin's absence created an even greater vacuum. The ministerial merry-go-round continued unabated, now without even the semblance of stability that Rasputin's consistent, albeit disastrous, influence had provided. Alexandra, left without her spiritual guide, became even more stubborn, more determined to rule alone, and even more detached from the realities of Russia. The illusion that Rasputin was the sole problem was shattered. His removal did not magically fix Russia's systemic issues: the ongoing war, the failing economy, the pervasive corruption, and the deep-seated social unrest. Instead, it stripped away the last veneer of mystical protection that the empress believed safeguarded the throne. His death served as a stark reminder of the monarchy's vulnerability and its inability to control its own destiny. Within a mere 2 months of Rasputin's murder, the February Revolution erupted in Petrograd. The Tsar was forced to abdicate, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. The assassination, meant to save the dynasty, ultimately removed a crucial, if controversial, linchpin, leaving the imperial family exposed and fatally weakened to the forces of revolution already gathering strength. Rasputin's prophecy of chaos and blood, made years before, was tragically fulfilled. Rasputin's prophetic words, chillingly, foreshadowed the fate of the imperial family. He had famously declared, "When I am killed, the imperial family will be killed. If I am killed by my own people, by Russian peasants, then the Tsar will remain. But if I am killed by boyars, the nobles, then my blood will stain their hands for 25 years and they will be forced to leave Russia. If they kill me, then within 6 months the whole of Russia will drown in blood." While the exact timeline was off, the essence of his prophecy proved tragically accurate. Rasputin was indeed killed by nobles, and within months, the Romanov dynasty was overthrown. On March 15, 1917, less than 3 months after Rasputin's murder, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The February Revolution, fueled by war weariness, economic hardship, and profound political discontent, had finally erupted. The imperial family was initially placed under house arrest at Tsarskoye Selo, then moved further into exile, first to Tobolsk in Siberia, and finally to Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. Their captors were the Bolsheviks, who had seized power in the October Revolution of 1917. The new Soviet regime, fearing a rescue attempt by anti-Bolshevik forces and viewing the Romanovs as a dangerous symbol of the old order, made the brutal decision to eliminate them. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, Tsar Nicholas II, Empress Alexandra, their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, and 4 of their loyal retainers were brutally executed in the basement of the Ipatiev house in Ekaterinburg. The firing squad left no survivors. The blood of the Romanovs, indeed, stained the hands of those who overthrew them, and the violence Rasputin predicted engulfed Russia in a brutal civil war that lasted for years. The memory of Rasputin, the Mad Monk, became inextricably linked with the downfall of the Romanovs. For many, his presence at court was the ultimate symbol of the monarchy's decadence and vulnerability, hastening its collapse by eroding public trust and undermining effective governance. He served as a convenient scapegoat for all of Russia's problems, embodying the chaos that was to come. The Romanovs, in their desperate attempt to save their hemophiliac son, had unknowingly invited the very force that would contribute to their destruction. Rasputin's influence, his prophecies, and his violent end are a chilling testament to the fragile line between faith and superstition, power and delusion, that characterized the twilight years of Imperial Russia. Their story, intertwined with his, remains one of history's most compelling tragedies. Grigori Rasputin, the Siberian peasant who rose to become one of the most controversial figures in Russian history, remains an enigma more than a century after his death. Was he a saintly mystic, divinely gifted with healing powers and prophetic insight, a true man of God tragically misunderstood? Or was he a cunning charlatan, a depraved opportunist who exploited the vulnerabilities of a desperate imperial family and a superstitious society for his own gain? The truth, as is often the case with such complex historical figures, likely lies somewhere in between these extremes, a tapestry woven from threads of genuine spiritual devotion, raw charisma, shrewd manipulation, and undeniable moral failings. Rasputin undeniably possessed a unique, magnetic personality. His piercing gaze, his simple yet profound pronouncements, and his ability to offer comfort and hope to the desperate were real. For Empress Alexandra, he was a savior, the only one who could alleviate her beloved Alexei's suffering. This deep, personal connection, born of a mother's desperation, was the bedrock of his power. Yet, his behavior was often scandalous, his drinking and womanizing legendary. He held no official position, yet wielded immense political influence, making and breaking careers, often with disastrous consequences for the stability of the Russian government, especially during the crucial years of World War I. He was not a German agent, as was often rumored, but his presence at court provided an easy target for those seeking to discredit the Empress and, by extension, the Tsar. Rasputin was a symptom, as much as a cause, of the Romanovs' downfall. Their isolation, their reliance on mysticism, their inability to connect with the needs of their people, and their fundamental weakness as rulers created the perfect environment for a figure like Rasputin to flourish. He filled a spiritual and political vacuum that the established institutions of the church and the state had failed to address. In the end, his assassination, intended to save the monarchy, merely accelerated its demise. It removed a crucial, if toxic, figure, but did nothing to address the deep-seated problems that plagued Imperial Russia. Instead, it only highlighted the fatal impotence of the court and the desperate, violent mood of the country. The legacy of Rasputin is a complex blend of myth and reality. He embodied the contradictions of pre-revolutionary Russia, a vast, deeply religious land on the cusp of modernity, where ancient superstitions clashed with revolutionary fervor. He was a symbol of both the profound spirituality and the pervasive corruption that characterized the dying days of the Romanov Empire. His story continues to fascinate, a dark cautionary tale of power, faith, and the catastrophic consequences when an empire loses its way. The Mad Monk remains, forever, an unforgettable shadow in the grand, tragic narrative of the last Tsar. His legend, like Russia itself, is vast, mysterious, and ultimately, profoundly unsettling.